December 1942. The Pacific sun glared down on the small airstrip of Naval Air Station Norfolk. The heat shimmered off the tarmac, and the engines of new American fighters idled nervously, waiting for their first taste of combat. Among them, one plane drew whispered amusement from the mechanics, the officers, and especially the enemy intelligence reports. Its fuselage was thick, almost cumbersome. Its wings looked broad and unwieldy. To the Japanese pilots observing from afar, this new machine, the Grumman F6F Hellcat, seemed destined for ridicule. In the skies over the Solomon Islands, Japanese Zero pilots had grown accustomed to dominance. Agile, sleek, and brutally efficient, the Zero had become a symbol of fear. Allied pilots approached the front with caution, knowing that any engagement with a Zero could end in minutes. And now, reports arrived of a new American fighter, one that seemed heavy, slow, and utterly outmatched. Japanese pilots laughed openly when shown photographs, shaking their heads at what they called the lumbering bird. They imagined easy victories, counting down the minutes until they could punctuate their aerial superiority with another kill. Inside the cockpit of the Hellcat prototype, American pilots bristled with nerves and determination. They had trained relentlessly, studying tactics, aerodynamics, and the few scraps of intelligence on the Zero. Yet even they felt the weight of doubt. The plane's appearance was ungraceful, a stark contrast to the Zero's sleek, predatory lines. Its bulk seemed to fly in defiance of everything they had learned about dogfighting. Everything they had been taught about speed and maneuverability. Across the Pacific, Japanese officers toasted their own cleverness. "This machine will not last a week in the skies," one muttered. "The Zero will outmaneuver it before it even fires a shot." They did not yet understand the calculus that would soon make the Hellcat lethal. Raw engine power, armored protection for the pilot, and a design that prioritized kill survivability over beauty. They were measuring the plane by its looks, as so many before them had done, blind to the innovations hidden beneath its steel skin. Test flights over the Hawaiian Islands had already hinted at the Hellcat's potential. Pilots reported an engine that roared like a predator, controls that responded with a mix of precision and force, and the kind of durability that could shrug off hits that would cripple other fighters. But news traveled slowly, and intelligence filtered through layers of assumption and bias. To the enemy, the story was clear. The Americans had built a cumbersome bird, heavy and slow, and destined to fail. As the first units prepared for deployment to the front lines, whispers among the American pilots hinted at a secret confidence. They knew the Hellcat could climb higher, dive faster, and carry a heavier payload than anyone suspected. But those words were private, hidden beneath the discipline of military restraint. Outside, the world only saw a lumbering, awkward silhouette on the runway. December 1942. Japanese pilots looked at the Hellcat and laughed. They spread tales of its predicted ineffectiveness through their squadrons. Their eyes never strayed from the sleek Zeros, the plane they trusted, the plane they had mastered. They celebrated what they assumed would be a brief American experiment. A clumsy imitation of a true fighter, but looks, as they would soon learn, can deceive. The Pacific War was about to teach a lesson that no photograph, no mockery, and no confidence could predict. A lesson written not in assumptions, but in speed, firepower, and the unforgiving calculus of aerial combat. And when the first Hellcats finally rose into the sky, the laughter would die abruptly, replaced by a shock that would echo across every Japanese carrier, every airfield, and every dogfight that followed. April 1942. The Pacific skies stretched endlessly above the Coral Islands, shimmering under the relentless sun. From Guadalcanal to the Marshall Islands, Japanese pilots ruled the air with a ferocity and precision that left Allied forces reeling. The Mitsubishi A6M was more than a plane. It was a symbol of technological mastery and a weapon of psychological dominance. Its sleek frame, feather-light construction, and unparalleled maneuverability allowed it to dance through the clouds, striking with deadly accuracy before any enemy could respond. American pilots entering the theater quickly learned the harsh truth. Survival against the Zero was a matter of chance as much as skill. Dogfights that lasted mere seconds often determined life or death. The Zero could climb faster, turn sharper, and dive with fluid grace. Its pilots, trained rigorously and emboldened by repeated victories, exuded confidence that bordered on arrogance. Reports of Zero kills were broadcast through Japanese squadrons with pride, reinforcing a belief that no rival could ever be built to match their ace fighters. Across the Pacific, American forces suffered in silence. Stories emerged of entire squadrons decimated in mere minutes, aircraft shredded mid-air, and pilots forced to bail out into shark-infested waters. The Zero was more than a technical marvel. It was a psychological weapon, teaching fear as efficiently as it taught aerial combat. Allied commanders watched from makeshift control towers as Japanese formations sliced through the sky, executing maneuvers that seemed impossible to replicate. They needed an answer, and time was scarce. Yet behind the headlines of defeat, American ingenuity quietly began to take shape. Engineers at Grumman Aircraft Works in New York analyzed every fragment of intelligence, every photo, every intercepted report. They dissected the Zero's advantages, its speed, agility, and long range. They measured its weaknesses, light armor, limited firepower, and vulnerability under sustained attack. While pilots feared the enemy in the Pacific, engineers envisioned a machine that could survive its onslaught and strike back with devastating precision. Japanese pilots, meanwhile, reveled in their supremacy. Stories circulated of aces who could outmaneuver any Allied plane with ease. They practiced complex aerial tactics, honing instincts that seemed almost preternatural. The Zero's reputation was not just built on performance. It was built on a culture of excellence, discipline, and relentless confidence. In the eyes of the world, they were untouchable. But even as Japan celebrated dominance, the seeds of disruption were quietly planted thousands of miles away. American engineers were sketching, testing, and iterating designs that would one day challenge the notion of invincibility. Every calculation, every wind tunnel test, every flight prototype in New York and California was a quiet rebellion against the myth of the Zero. The Pacific War seemed to tilt entirely in favor of Japan, a reign of speed and supremacy that no one dared question. Yet, across the ocean, a different kind of battle was underway. One fought not in the clouds, but in the minds of men determined to turn fear into innovation. Across the ocean, however, American engineers were quietly designing the answer. Mid-1942, Grumman Aircraft Works hummed with the tension of urgency and ambition. Engineers hunched over drafting tables, their eyes scanning blueprints and annotated sketches. Every line, every curve, every measurement had to be precise. The Pacific Theater demanded more than innovation. It demanded survival, dominance, and a machine capable of rewriting the rules of aerial combat. The F6F Hellcat, still only a concept on paper, was destined to do just that. The engineers pored over combat reports, absorbing every detail of encounters with the Mitsubishi Zero. They analyzed the brutal efficiency of the enemy, the Zero's extreme maneuverability, its ability to climb with astonishing speed, its uncanny agility that left American pilots scrambling. But they were not intimidated, they were calculating. Where the Zero excelled, the Hellcat would compensate. Where the Zero's design left vulnerabilities, the Hellcat would exploit them. Meetings with frontline pilots became daily rituals. Veterans returned from the Pacific with stories of narrow escapes, blazing dogfights, and the limits of American aircraft. They described how the Zeros could spiral behind a plane in an instant, tear through wings and fuselages with deadly accuracy, and disappear before anyone could mount a counterattack. Engineers listened carefully, translating these tales into technical requirements. armor plating to protect the pilot, reinforced fuselage to absorb damage, and an engine powerful enough to outclimb and outrun its enemies. Every anecdote, every complaint, every hope became part of the blueprint. The Hellcat's design broke from conventional wisdom. Unlike the Zero, which prioritized elegance and lightness above all else, the Hellcat embraced raw power and resilience. Its bulk was intentional, its weight a feature, not a flaw. The cockpit was armored, providing protection against bullets that would have shredded a Zero. Its 650 caliber machine guns were distributed for maximum firepower, allowing pilots to deliver devastating bursts without losing control. And beneath the sleek, deceptively simple exterior, the engine roared with a capacity designed to outperform anything in the Pacific skies. Engineers debated tirelessly over every detail. Wing shape, fuel capacity, propeller design, none of it was arbitrary. The goal was not to mimic the Zero, but to dominate it. Durability became a mantra. Survivability was a requirement. Speed and maneuverability were recalibrated to balance firepower, protection, and pilot control. The Hellcat had to be a fighter that could endure the worst the Pacific could throw at it and emerge capable of returning with victory. Not just survival, yet even as the final designs were approved, one question remained unresolved. Could this machine, seemingly heavy and awkward on the drawing board, survive in actual combat? The simulations, the tests, the wind tunnels, they could predict performance. But they could not replicate the chaos, the adrenaline, or the lethal unpredictability of a dogfight over the Pacific. Grumman pilots began the first test flights. The Hellcat lumbering off the tarmac with a roar that startled even seasoned mechanics. Each takeoff, each maneuver, each dive brought new revelations. The plane responded with precision, shrugging off what would have been catastrophic stress in other fighters. Confidence grew among those who had doubted its appearance. But the ultimate test still lay ahead. The world had yet to witness the moment when the Hellcat would be judged not by drawings, not by calculations, and not by appearances, but by fire. The Pacific War was moving toward a turning point, and the Hellcat would soon take its place in history. Now, it needed a trial by fire. November 1943, the sun rose over the Solomon Islands, casting a golden haze across the jungle canopy and the sprawling network of airstrips carved from coral and earth. From the ground, the roar of engines heralded a new presence in the Pacific, the Grumman F6F Hellcat. Pilots had trained for months, refining their tactics, memorizing every nuance of the aircraft's power. But even they knew that theory could only take them so far. Combat would be the ultimate test. As Hellcats climbed into formation, Japanese pilots glanced skyward and laughed. From their perspective, nothing had changed. They still flew the Zero, still believed in its unmatched maneuverability, still trusted that speed and agility would guarantee victory. The new American fighter, to their eyes, appeared bulky, heavy, almost awkward. They expected an easy kill, a routine encounter to punctuate their reign. The first skirmish began over the dense jungles near Bougainville. Zeros dove with lethal precision, expecting the Hellcats to falter under pressure. But something unexpected happened. The Hellcat's power came alive. With a sudden burst of speed, it climbed sharply, trading altitude for advantage, and its guns roared with devastating accuracy. Japanese pilots, trained to exploit every opening, found themselves suddenly on the defensive. The Hellcat's design revealed its cunning. Its 650 caliber machine guns could unleash a sustained, punishing barrage, far outmatching the Zero's lighter armament. Its rugged frame absorbed hits that would have downed any other plane, allowing pilots to maintain control under fire. And in the crucial moments when dogfights became tight spirals of life and death, the Hellcat could turn inside the Zero. Outmaneuvering the supposedly superior fighter, reports from the first engagements spread quickly through both sides. American pilots marveled at how well the plane handled the chaos of combat, how it could shrug off bullets, dive with precision, and return fire with deadly efficiency. The lessons of months spent in wind tunnels and on test strips now manifested in the air, real and unforgiving. The Hellcat was no longer a theoretical answer to the Zero. It was a predator in its own right. Japanese pilots, initially dismissive, began to recognize the unexpected. Zeros that had once danced through the sky with near impunity were now forced into evasive maneuvers. One by one, familiar tactics proved insufficient. The seemingly awkward Hellcat could climb faster at critical moments, deliver heavier firepower, and endure attacks that would have crippled lighter planes. The shock was slow to register but undeniable. The balance of power in the skies was shifting. On the ground, American crews celebrated cautiously, aware that these early victories were just the beginning. The Pacific had been a theater of fear and unpredictability, and every kill was earned at immense risk. Yet for the first time, pilots sensed hope, a tangible, electrifying shift. The Hellcat was proving that preparation, innovation, and careful design could overcome even the most intimidating enemy. Across the ocean, Japanese reports began to reflect unease, though disbelief lingered. The enemy's confidence had been built on years of dominance, but now cracks appeared in the myth of invincibility. The lumbering plane they had mocked could fight, could survive, and could kill. Soon, the laugh would turn into shock. Early 1944, the Pacific was a crucible, testing men, machines, and strategies in equal measure. On the decks of aircraft carriers and in the coral-strewn airstrips, American pilots prepared for missions with a discipline that went beyond flying skill. They were not just learning to handle the Hellcat, they were learning to fight as a system, to turn the aircraft's strengths into battlefield dominance, unlike the Japanese, who still clung to individual dogfighting prowess. U.S. Navy training emphasized coordination. Pilots drilled in energy fighting, a method that relied on altitude, speed, and tactical positioning rather than pure maneuverability. They practiced wingman formations that allowed one pilot to attack while another covered, creating overlapping fields of fire. Every climb, dive, and turn was designed to exploit the Hellcat's engine power, armored fuselage, and heavy guns. Victory depended not just on skill, but on collective execution. Lessons were reinforced in simulated dogfights over training fields in California and Hawaii. Pilots learned to read the sky, anticipate enemy maneuvers, and make split-second decisions that could mean life or death. The Hellcat's stability allowed them to fire accurately under pressure, and its durability offered a confidence few pilots had felt in previous aircraft. Every pilot carried the same understanding: survive the first engagement, conserve energy, and strike decisively. Across the Pacific, Japanese pilots maintained the tactics that had carried them to dominance. They prized individual skill above teamwork, relying on the Zero's agility to outturn, outclimb, and outsmart their opponents. In the early days of the war, these methods had worked spectacularly. But as the Hellcat began to appear in growing numbers, these doctrines revealed their weaknesses. Individual heroics could no longer compensate for an enemy who fought as a coordinated, calculated force. American squadrons adapted quickly. Pilots who understood the balance between aggression and preservation flourished, while those who clung to instinctive dogfighting often found themselves outmatched. The combination of Hellcat engineering and tactical innovation created a force multiplier. More than a machine, more than a pilot, it was a disciplined system capable of overwhelming even the most experienced Zero aces. Reports from initial engagements reflected the change. Japanese pilots found themselves surprised not only by the Hellcat's capabilities, but by the precision and coordination of its operators. Zeros that had once terrorized the skies now encountered formations where every move was anticipated, every escape route covered. Frustration and confusion began to creep into the formerly unshakable ranks of the Japanese air forces. By mid-1944, the Pacific skies were becoming a proving ground for the new American method. The combination of superior tactics, rigorous training, and a plane designed to exploit these advantages was shifting the momentum. Where once Japanese pilots laughed at the Hellcat's bulk, they now faced a disciplined, relentless force that struck with both power and precision. The result was a storm that swept across the Pacific. June 19th, 1944. The sky above the Philippine Sea stretched endless and blue, a vast stage for what would become one of the most decisive aerial battles of World War II. Fleets of aircraft carriers gleamed like islands of steel on the sparkling water below, their decks alive with the rhythm of engines, shouting sailors and pilots preparing for war. On this day, the U.S. Navy was about to demonstrate the deadly potential of the F6F Hellcat. The Japanese, confident in their remaining air power, launched wave after wave of Mitsubishi Zeros and torpedo bombers, intent on crippling the American carriers. They believed in their experience, in the agility of their planes, and in the superiority that had dominated the Pacific skies for nearly 3 years. They did not yet understand that the game had changed. As the first Hellcats climbed into the high-altitude sun, their pilots executed maneuvers drilled into them over months of rigorous training. Wingmen stayed tight, energy fighting dictated every dive and climb, and the heavy guns of the Hellcat roared with relentless accuracy. Unlike previous encounters, the American fighters were not isolated individuals trying to survive. They were a coordinated, almost unstoppable force. The battle quickly escalated into a maelstrom of aircraft and fire. Japanese pilots were stunned. Zeros, once feared for their precision, found themselves outgunned and outmaneuvered at every turn. The Hellcat's durability allowed it to absorb hits that would have grounded or destroyed other planes, while its firepower shredded enemy formations with terrifying efficiency. By the end of the first hours, entire waves of Japanese aircraft were decimated before they could reach the American fleet. Allied pilots reported an almost surreal experience. Where previously combat had been a desperate struggle for survival, now they found themselves pressing advantages, exploiting the Hellcat's superior speed in dives and climbs, and watching as the enemy faltered under sustained coordinated attacks. The sky itself seemed to bend to American tactics. Every turn of the Hellcat, a calculated strike rather than a gamble. The outcome of the battle earned it the nickname that would echo through history, the Great Mariana's Turkey Shoot. Estimates of Japanese losses soared into the hundreds, with aircraft destroyed in mid-air and pilots forced to abandon their doomed machines over the ocean. American losses, by contrast, were remarkably low, a testament not only to the aircraft's design, but to the training, discipline, and strategic foresight that had made the Hellcat a weapon unlike any the Pacific had seen. Beyond the destruction, the psychological impact was profound. Japanese airmen who survived spoke of disbelief and fear, their confidence shaken by an enemy that had anticipated their every move. The legend of the Zero, once untouchable and feared, was under siege. And for the Americans, the battle was more than a tactical victory. It was proof that preparation, innovation, and resilience could overcome the myth of invincibility that had dominated the Pacific skies. The great carrier battles demonstrated the culmination of engineering, training, and tactical evolution. The Hellcat was no longer just a machine. It had become a symbol of American adaptability and power, capable of turning overwhelming odds into victory. From the decks of the carriers to the sky itself, the balance of air supremacy had shifted irrevocably. The numbers told a story Japan could no longer ignore. March 1944. The Pacific was a theater of extremes, blazing sun, violent storms, and skies alive with death and defiance. Amid this chaos, the F6F Hellcat earned a reputation not only for firepower, but for an almost legendary toughness. Unlike the Mitsubishi Zero, which relied on lightness and agility, the Hellcat was built to survive. Every rivet, every reinforced bulkhead, every armored cockpit panel was a testament to a philosophy American engineers had embraced. A plane must not only fight, it must endure. Stories of damaged, Hellcats returning to base began to spread among pilots and crews. An aircraft, riddled with bullet holes across its wings and fuselage, had barely cleared the tree line before crash landing on a carrier deck. The pilot emerged shaken but alive to the astonishment of his comrades. Another plane returned, with its tail almost severed, engine smoking and controls barely responsive. Yet it landed safely, a grim testament to both design and pilot skill. These accounts were passed from squadron to squadron, whispered in briefing rooms, and celebrated quietly in mess halls. The contrast with the Zero could not have been starker. Japanese planes, built for speed and finesse, were elegant but fragile. A single well-placed shot could ignite fuel lines, shatter wings, or disable a control surface. Pilots who survived the first moments of engagement often did not survive the return flight. In comparison, the Hellcat's ruggedness gave pilots a rare advantage: the chance to fight another day, to correct mistakes, to survive where others would perish. Morale on both sides began to reflect this difference. American pilots flew with a growing sense of confidence, knowing that even when under fire, their machine could endure the punishment. They pushed the envelope, testing the limits of the Hellcat in combat, learning to exploit its strengths with daring maneuvers that had been impossible in earlier fighters. The psychological edge was clear. Fear was diminished when a pilot knew his plane could take hits and still bring him home. Japanese pilots, on the other hand, faced an unsettling reality. Encounters with the Hellcat no longer guaranteed a kill, no longer guaranteed an easy escape. Every engagement carried new variables. The fragile Zero could be destroyed with a single miscalculation, and even experienced aces began to see the cost of overconfidence. The aura of invincibility that had once shielded them psychologically was eroding under the relentless resilience of American engineering and tactics. On the carriers and island bases, stories of near-miraculous returns became part of the daily narrative. Pilots who survived overwhelming odds were celebrated not just for skill, but for the aircraft that had shielded them. These tales inspired new recruits, reassured veterans, and slowly turned morale into an instrument of war itself. The confidence gained from flying a plane that could absorb punishment and respond with deadly efficiency translated into sharper decisions, bolder attacks, and a collective determination that the Pacific War could be won. By mid-1944, the Hellcat was more than a fighter. It was a psychological weapon. Its reputation for survivability spread through the ranks, reaching ears both in the United States and among the Japanese forces, who could not ignore the growing tide of losses and the resilience of American pilots, and morale itself became a weapon. Late 1944, the Pacific skies, once dominated by the elegant silhouettes of Mitsubishi Zeros, were now increasingly punctuated by the formidable shape of the Hellcat. From the decks of aircraft carriers to hastily constructed island airstrips, waves of the American fighter poured into the theater, each aircraft a product of meticulous engineering, relentless testing, and the industrial might of a nation mobilized for total war. The tide was turning, and Japan was struggling to keep pace. The Japanese air forces faced a crisis of attrition. Every engagement with Hellcats chipped away at their ranks, and the experienced aces who had once struck fear across the Pacific were becoming irreplaceable losses. Training new pilots to the level of the veterans who had mastered the Zero took years, yet every encounter with American forces accelerated the depletion of both machines and skill. In contrast, the United States could replenish squadrons almost endlessly. Hellcats rolled off assembly lines by the dozens, backed by a support system of mechanics, engineers, and training programs designed to keep both plane and pilot in the fight. On the front lines, this imbalance became painfully clear. Dogfights over the Philippines, Formosa, and the Marianas Islands increasingly favored the Americans, not solely because of superior tactics or design, but because of numbers and continuity. Where the Japanese once relied on instinctive skill, American pilots now leveraged the combined power of coordinated strategy, durable aircraft, and a growing cadre of trained aviators. Each Hellcat pilot understood the role of formation, energy fighting, and situational awareness. Each encounter compounded Japan's losses and hardened U.S. resolve. The psychological impact was as profound as the material one. Japanese pilots, once confident in the Zero's superiority, now faced a relentless opponent in both machine and mind. Every loss was a blow not only to their numbers, but to morale. The myth of invincibility crumbled under the combined weight of engineering excellence, pilot training, and industrial output. Meanwhile, American forces grew bolder, striking deeper into enemy territory, confident in the knowledge that any losses could be quickly replaced, and that the Hellcat's resilience gave every pilot a fighting chance to return home. Strategically, the shift reshaped the Pacific War. Control of the skies dictated the success of naval operations, amphibious landings, and the protection of supply lines. With Hellcats achieving air superiority, Japanese forces found themselves increasingly constrained, unable to defend key positions, unable to project power across the ocean. Every engagement was a lesson. The balance had shifted, and the once feared Zero was no longer enough to turn the tide. From the ground and air alike, the message was unmistakable. The industrial and tactical synergy of the United States, embodied in the Hellcat and its pilots, was overwhelming a system that had thrived on agility, skill, and tradition. Japan could fight bravely, but it could not fight endlessly, and the attrition was accelerating with every sortie. By 1945, the skies told a new story. Early 1945, the Pacific was a cauldron of fire, smoke, and relentless motion. From the decks of carriers to the skies above Japanese-held islands, the roar of engines announced the arrival of a force that had transformed the course of the war. The F6F Hellcat, once laughed at for its bulk and appearance, now led the charge. A hunter in a sky that had once been dominated by the Zero, Hellcats escorted waves of B-29 bombers on strategic raids, their pilots scanning the horizon for any sign of resistance. Japanese defenders scrambled desperately, attempting to mount intercepts with aircraft increasingly outmatched in firepower, protection, and coordination. The Hellcat's 650 caliber guns tore through formations of enemy planes, while its rugged design allowed pilots to press attacks that would have been suicidal in earlier aircraft. Every engagement was a demonstration of lessons learned, engineering perfected, and tactics honed over years of relentless combat. The contrast with early encounters could not have been more striking. Where Japanese pilots had once laughed at the Hellcat's appearance, now their faces reflected shock, fear, and disbelief. The Zeros, elegant but fragile, could no longer dictate the terms of combat. Even experienced aces found themselves overpowered, outmaneuvered, and outgunned. The hunter had become the hunted, and the skies bore witness to a reversal few had anticipated. Stories of Hellcat pilots surviving punishing encounters spread like wildfire among Allied forces. Aircraft riddled with bullets returned safely to carriers and airstrips, while their pilots carried tales of precise dives, sustained fire, and tactical brilliance. Each successful mission reinforced the aircraft's reputation as both a machine of war and a symbol of American ingenuity. In these final months, the Hellcat was not merely a fighter, it was a statement. Endurance, preparation, and coordinated strategy could overcome even the most daunting adversary. Japanese defenders, facing waves of Hellcats and bombers, confronted the grim reality of attrition and obsolescence. Numbers no longer favored them, and experience alone could not compensate for the overwhelming combination of American production, training, and aircraft design. The legend of the Zero, once untouchable, was reduced to a memory in the face of the relentless American tide. By mid-1945, as raids intensified and the end of the conflict approached, the Hellcat had proven itself beyond doubt. It had protected bombers, destroyed enemy fighters, and secured the skies for Allied operations. The aircraft that had seemed awkward, clumsy, and unworthy in the eyes of the enemy had become one of the most effective tools of the Pacific Campaign, a testament to engineering foresight, tactical innovation, and the courage of those who flew it. And after the guns fell silent, its legacy endured. August 1945. The Pacific skies, once a theater of terror and uncertainty, had fallen silent. The roar of engines, the flash of gunfire, and the spiraling dogfights that had defined the last 3 years of war were memories etched into the minds of those who had lived through them. Amid the aftermath, one story stood above all: the rise of the Grumman F6F Hellcat, the plane that had once been the subject of ridicule and disbelief. Japanese pilots, who in 1942 had laughed at its bulk and seemingly clumsy design, now spoke of it with grudging respect. Accounts surfaced of veterans acknowledging the Hellcat's advantages: its ability to absorb punishment, its unmatched firepower, and the tactical acumen of the American pilots who flew it. The aircraft they had once underestimated had rewritten the rules of engagement, turning the Pacific into a proving ground for innovation, preparation, and resilience. The numbers alone told a story that could not be disputed. The Hellcat was credited with destroying over 5,000 enemy aircraft, more than any other Allied fighter in the war. Its victories were not mere statistics. They represented the survival of pilots, the protection of fleets, and the strategic edge that allowed the United States to gain air superiority across vast stretches of ocean. Each kill was a testament to careful design, meticulous training, and the relentless pursuit of excellence. Yet beyond the figures lay a deeper lesson. The Hellcat's success was never accidental. It was the product of foresight, engineers who refused to be intimidated by appearances, pilots who mastered tactics over instinct alone, and a military system capable of translating innovation into decisive action. Every dogfight, every raid, every mission reflected a principle that extended beyond war: preparation, adaptability, and attention to hidden variables can overturn seemingly insurmountable odds. For the men who flew the Hellcat, the machine became an extension of themselves. Its armored cockpit protected them, its firepower empowered them, and its resilience gave them confidence that few fighters could provide. Pilots learned to trust the aircraft in ways that went beyond mechanics, cultivating a psychological edge that amplified every tactical decision. The Hellcat was more than metal and fuel. It was a symbol of reliability, ingenuity, and the quiet power of careful engineering. Across the Pacific, the psychological impact was just as significant. Japanese forces, forced to confront losses that could not be quickly replaced, saw the myth of invincibility crumble. The Zero, once untouchable, became a reminder that underestimation could be fatal. The battles that had begun with laughter and scorn had ended with lessons in humility, strategy, and the consequences of failing to anticipate innovation. Even decades later, historians, pilots, and enthusiasts reflect on the Hellcat not merely as a weapon, but as an embodiment of American values in war: resilience, ingenuity, and the willingness to challenge assumptions. It proved that victory was rarely determined by raw elegance or superficial strength. It was earned through preparation, adaptation, and the courage to confront what others overlook. The story of the Hellcat is a story of transformation. From a prototype mocked by the enemy to a legendary fighter that dominated the skies, it carved its place in history not simply through performance, but through the combination of human skill, engineering brilliance, and tactical innovation. The Hellcat was more than a machine. It was proof that in war, underestimation can be fatal.